In this lesson, we will move our camera and layers in position to prepare for the final shot of our scene. Okay, so for the final piece of our composition that we've been making, I want the camera to pan back over to the shapes that we had there in the middle at the beginning, and I want that to be the last part of our scene. Now, it's going to take a little bit of preparation to get our camera and shapes into position, so let's go ahead and get started with that now. I'm just going to push this up a little bit so that you can see where we're kind of coming from here. And I want to drag this forward in time so that there's enough time for these pieces of text to be read before we animate our camera away from that point. So I'm going to drag that zoom in back there. And then just kind of move forward, probably right here around 22 seconds, 22, 23 seconds. I'm going to set my keyframe. So scroll back down there to the null object, and we'll just go ahead and add a keyframe to set a position up. Then I'm just going to scrub forward to almost 25 seconds, and we'll just start moving our null object down towards our shapes. So this is where our shapes were earlier, but it looks like whenever we created our comp or added some time to the rest of our comp, these were not extended with the rest of our layers. So I'm going to come down here, and this looks like that's one of my shapes, and this is as well. Now the other shape is living inside of this composition here. So because it has this little black triangle on the end, we can't extend it. So I'm going to need to go inside of this composition to extend those layers and add a little bit of time to this composition. So we'll come up here to composition settings, and I'm going to change the duration to be 32 seconds, just like we did for our main composition. And then let's go ahead and see where this ends here. Now, this is the main layer that I have for that teal circle, and these other two things I'm not going to need for the last part of my shot. So I'm not going to extend those. I'm just going to let them end where they're at now. Okay, let's go back out to our main composition. And you can see that this area here is grayed out, and we're now able to drag that over to the edge and see where that ends. So now we've kind of created a little bit of an animation like this now that we've set that null up. And something kind of strange that's happening is that dreams fulfilled piece of text sort of flickers off here. So what I want to do is just kind of zoom out so I can see that whole composition. And then right there before we come to those shapes, I want to trim that dreams fulfilled layer so that it's not going to be flickering off once my camera gets there. And that's just going to be this layer right there, layer 14, the dreams.ai comp. So you can go ahead and just bring that back to the current time indicator. And now when we scrub, we see that that has already disappeared. Okay, so now what I want to add is another keyframe to this animation so that we get kind of a zoom in to these shapes. So I'm just going to drag my current time indicator a little bit past that keyframe that you see there. And we can go ahead and set another key for this to zoom in towards those shapes. Okay, so now if we drag this animation, we see that we're zooming into the shapes after we kind of just come to this position where we can see all of the shapes together. And you'll notice that another thing is happening that maybe you didn't intend to happen. And it's that we kind of get swung out a little bit here to the left, and then it comes back in towards the middle, just as we scrub this part right here. And that just happens whenever you're using 3D layers, and a lot of times definitely happens when you're using a null object to control a camera. So I want to show you how to fix that. What's happening is a change in our interpolation. So right now we've only talked about temporal interpolation up until this point, and that's just talking about the speed. But spatial interpolation is also determined by our keyframes. So right now it's really the same idea. Whenever you have these Bezier keyframes, they give you this kind of ease in and ease out in your speed. But it also can change the motion path that has been created to kind of have that curve in it, the same way that we saw the curve in our speed graph. So you can kind of see that happening there. The same thing is happening to our position. So all I have to do to fix that is highlight these three keyframes that are involved in this animation, and then we'll come up here to the top and click animation and come down to keyframe interpolation. So go ahead and choose that option. And just like we've said so far, the temporal interpolation is set to Bezier, but our spatial interpolation is set to auto Bezier. So I want to come in here and change that spatial interpolation from auto Bezier to linear. And if we change that, now if I scrub through this animation, it's just going to zoom directly into those shapes like I want it to, and we're not going to get any kind of swing motion there. So now let's do a quick RAM preview of these 3 keys that we've set up just to see what the timing looks like for that camera animation in real time. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the B key and then kind of scoot over there and hit the N key just so we're only previewing this small area. And then we'll hit the 0 key on our number pad to begin the RAM preview. And one of the things I'm already noticing just as I'm kind of looking over the composition is that that middle keyframe is still set to easy ease. So what's going to happen is whenever our animation hits that point, it's going to slow down, stop, and then slow back out as it eases onto this last key. And this might look a little bit strange. So what I want it to look like is really just more of a fluid motion where it zooms down to the circles and then begins zooming in almost instantaneously as it hits this keyframe. So an easy way for us to fix that is to change this middle keyframe to an auto Bezier keyframe. And you don't have to worry about this changing the spatial interpolation. It's only going to affect the temporal interpolation. So an easy way for us to change this keyframe is simply to select it, hold Control, and click it twice. Now I've only clicked it once so far, and you'll notice that that sent that back to a linear keyframe. And I'm going to do it one more time, holding Control, clicking it, and now we have this round keyframe type. So let's do a quick RAM preview and we can watch this through. Now, if you remember earlier, we had those roving keyframes that were also round. And so those act very similarly to these auto Bezier keyframes. They are both round. The roving keyframes are just a little bit smaller to show you that they're a set of roving keyframes. But they have the same kind of timing where we take the interpolation from the keyframe before it and after it, and then it's distributed across the area there. And then this keyframe in between is really just a point that is hit. So if you watch this animation, that's clearly what's happening. We just come to that point and then begin zooming in right away. There's no more stop. Okay, so one last thing that I want to add to this is a little bit of a movement for these shapes themselves, because once they actually are zoomed in on here, this looks a little bit strange. So right about the time that we have this key here, this auto Bezier key, I want the shapes to begin moving from their current positions so that they overlap all in the middle there. So I'm going to go ahead and put keyframes on all 3 of these shapes. So let's just go ahead and bring up the position property for those. And then we'll click over here to add or remove keyframes. And we'll need to come in here and set the stopwatch for the circle one as well. So now what I need to do is kind of just right about here is where I want that last keyframe to land, but I can't see where I'm moving these shapes at all once it's zoomed in this far. So I'm going to go ahead and scrub backwards just to a little bit after where these keys were set, and then move my layers into position. And then I'll be able to just move all of those keys forward and put them into place once we have our shapes set up. Okay, so that looks pretty good right there. Now let's go ahead and scrub through that and just make sure that we're in the right position. And that looks great right there. So now I'm just going to move those last 3 keyframes that we set into position on the last key of my nulls transition. So now let's do a quick RAM preview just to watch this through. And we'll probably want to add just a little bit of interpolation to these keys because right now they look like they're going to kind of hit a little bit hard, and we probably don't need to add any at all to the last key just because we won't be able to see whenever that hits because we're zoomed in so far, but we definitely want to do that for the first set of keys. So let's go ahead and select all of those keys, and we'll just turn those to easy ease. And if you remember, the keyboard shortcut for that is just to select the keys and hit F9, and we don't have to go through the animation menu to set that up. So that looks pretty good just like that. And later we can talk about changing this color here just so it doesn't look so dark. So in this lesson, we set some final animation keyframes to move our camera and shapes into place so that we can finish our composition.